Okay. Um, this is the hard part for me always.
The
Welcome
intro.
to the Trans-Apocalyptic Oasis show. I am Marshall Eon, and this show is about transcending and including the apocalypse. I'm here with Josh Leonard. He is the executive director of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, which which is promoting the post-progressive project. Welcome to the apocalypse, Josh.
Thanks, Marshall. Glad to be here.
So, let's start out. What is the Institute for Cultural Evolution?
So it is a small think tank based out of Boulder. I'm actually in Oakland, but Steve McIntosh, the president, and a bunch of the other folks who are associated with the organization are based out of Boulder. It was started in 2013, I believe. And has evolved quite a bit over the years, but I was brought on in February of 2020. For February of this year, 2021, as the executive director. So I was really brought on to sort of advance the post-progressive project, to get this publication, the post-progressive post off the ground. So for the first 6 months of the job, it was mostly building that site and getting everything ready for launch, getting contributors, that kind of thing. So we've launched that in June and have been trying to, ultimately the goal of the Institute and the project is to try and get integral thinking out into the mainstream, and in particular to try and address the culture war that's driving our broken politics. So, we can talk a lot more about it, I'm sure, but that's what we're really focused on right now. We feel like this is the time for a new perspective that can integrate the different positions and ideologies that are fighting it out in the culture war, and be able to offer something new that's constructive and might move us forward as a country.
So, is it fair to say you're trying to save the world?
Yeah, it's fair to say. It's a tall task, similar to your goals with the trans apocalypse.
Yeah. Well, I'm not trying to save the world. I'm just trying to survive the apocalypse. Well, so I met Steve last year.
Yeah.
We took a walk around Boulder. If you look in the Trans-Apocalyptic Oasis group, you'll find a picture of the two of us giving the finger.
Giving the bird, yeah. I was surprised you got Steve to do that.
Yeah, I get people to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do, so that's why you're here.
Yeah, that's right. We'll see what I'm doing before the show's over.
Yeah, so I do want to talk about post progressive, but also I want to talk about pandemic stuff
Yeah.
because that was really the impetus for you coming on this show was an exchange you had in the group.
Yeah.
Um, so my first question to you is the pandemic real?
Yes, in my opinion, the pandemic is very much real. Although I can understand why people in their own personal experience may have doubts about that, because uh, even those of us who have lived in places where there have been waves, maybe here or there may know one person here, one person there who got sick, or contracted coronavirus. But yes, in my informed opinion, it is real.
Okay, what does it mean to be real?
Well, I guess it means that it is based on a biological fact that there is a virus that has essentially loosed itself on the world. Happens about once every 100 years. That crosses a certain threshold of transmissibility, uh, you know, death rates, health complications. It's reached a certain threshold in terms of how far it's spread and what the impact of it is biologically, that rates it as a pandemic. I'm not obviously a immunologist, so I
Right.
don't exactly know what those thresholds are, but I think it's safe to say that it is crossed that threshold, given the number of deaths, the number of cases, and the impact it's had worldwide.
That's a good answer. So do you think it's sort of it's of natural origin?
I think I'm still up in the air about that one. I was actually one of the folks, unlike many of my, many people in my circles, who, when I heard that there was a, virology institute in Wuhan that was studying coronaviruses early on in the pandemic, thought, I wonder if there's something to the fact that this might have leaked from there. So I don't know for sure. We may never know for sure, but I think it's certainly a conceivable possibility that this was a lab leak.
I got you. So you're a conspiracy theorist.
I wouldn't go that far, but I think we have to be open to the facts, and we have to use our common sense in scenarios, right? So we can't just toe the party line. And when that just seemed to me from the very beginning to be a coincidence that was too big to dismiss.
So speaking of coincidences, what do you think of this Fauci guy?
I'm generally supportive of Fauci. I think he's been put in the difficult position of being of having to sort of be the spokesperson for the public health reaction to something that we don't know a lot about. And so I think he's certainly made some mistakes. I think he's certainly gotten some things wrong. But on the whole, I believe that he has earned the right to be that mouthpiece and to some degree steer the country's response. So I'm pro Fauci.
Okay, but I don't really pay a lot of attention to this, but didn't he support some gain of function research or something like that?
I think that is a semantic issue that I don't know enough about to be able to say whether or not he was being dishonest when he said that they were or weren't supporting gain of function research. They were funding the Wuhan lab's work to some degree. I don't know whether they were doing gain of function or not. And again, I'm not qualified to sort of say whether, and I'm not trying to skirt the issue. I just literally am not qualified to be able to say whether or not he's being dishonest by saying that they weren't supporting gain of function research.
That's pretty honest. Most people who don't understand this stuff will say, absolutely, he was doing that.
Right. There was a story that came out, can't remember where it was. It was Fox, maybe. It was maybe 7 or 8 months ago. And it didn't really get the traction that I thought it would. But there were indications that basically some visiting American scientists were visiting the Wuhan lab back in 2017, and that there were scientists there who were complaining to the visiting scientists that they didn't feel like the safety protocols were in place at the Wuhan lab. And that got ran up the chain, into the Trump administration. And, I get it. Not everything reaches its way to the top. I'm not trying to make any conspiracy theories there, but there is some evidence that the safety practices that were going on in the Wuhan lab were not up to snuff. And so again, more potential evidence for the fact that there's a possibility this escape from the lab.
So yeah, it's China's fault then.
To some degree, sure. We can give them some culpability, that's for sure.
Okay. I actually want to talk more about China, but I'm just curious if it seems like the pandemic, like the sort of collective consciousness around it skews alarmist in a lot of way, which is, I think, understandable given the self-preservation instinct that humans have and the history of these sorts of things. What do you think about that? Are we too alarmist about it?
I think there's even that's not necessarily a straightforward answer, because I think it depends on where you are in your knowledge of the science behind the pandemic. So just were we alarmist early on? Sure, in retrospect, we can say that we were, but I wouldn't say that we were irrationally alarmist at the beginning because we knew so little. And there was good reason, especially at the beginning, to not necessarily, again, trust the information coming out of China, because we know that there's so much control there over narratives and what gets out, that we couldn't be sure that we were getting honest information about what the nature of the virus was. So I think at the beginning we had to take some initial steps until we could get our hands around what the nature of the threat was. And then after that, as the science starts to come in, as we start to learn more about it, I think there is good reason to, weigh the relative risks. And I feel like that, I'm not an anti-mainstream media person the way that some of your other guests might be, but I do think that we were not approaching this in the nuanced way that we needed to, which is balancing the relative risks of economic trade-offs and mental health trade-offs of, all of that with the relative risk of the virus. And so I think we've gotten better at doing that. And if I'm going to fault Fauci for anything, it's that, they're generally going to give you sort of the most conservative argument about what we should be doing to protect ourselves when, and not letting the public decide for themselves, because it's, I think that they're recognizing it's difficult for people to ascertain that risk for themselves. And they're sort of setting a low threshold for risk that they're setting as the policy. And I think more nuanced responses could be given all those trade-offs.
That's a good answer. Okay. So let's talk about post-progressive.
Okay.
What is post about it?
Well, what's post about it is that we are, trying to send and include progressivism. And by progressivism, we're at the Institute, we're trying to use terms that are descriptive and that are for these different stages of, consciousness or different worldviews, that we're trying to use descriptive terms, and we're trying to use terms that the general public might resonate with and understand. So we don't go around using spiral dynamics or integral colors or anything like that. As much as we can, we try to use these terms, which is traditional, modern, progressive, and then post-progressive.
Which Steve does in his book, right? Developmental Politics.
Yep. In Developmental Politics, that's where he starts to sort of do those terms. Although I don't think post-progressive, he hadn't settled on that term when he finished the book.
Right. And I can see why he wouldn't decide to use trans-progressive. Because that means something altogether different.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, exactly. So post-progressive, because we're, partially the other thing that we're trying to do in bringing this, integral perspective into the mainstream, you have to be careful with this idea of stages. Not to say that we're going to shy away from it, but if you go out there and emphasize the sort of stage aspect of it, then you are going to turn off a lot of people who might be open to your message.
So you turn stages into types.
Almost.
Or treat them as types. Almost.
Yeah, as types. Really, they're worldviews, and in that sense, they're types. Now, if you read through the different pieces that we have in Post-Progressive Post or on our Facebook group or whatnot, you'll find references to stages and development, but we don't necessarily think that there are some valuable concepts that can be conveyed that would potentially impact the way that we're fighting the culture war, that don't necessarily require you to put one stage or one worldview on top of or underneath another.
Other than yours.
Other than ours. Ours is the only one that gets to float above the rest. Yes, right? That's correct.
Okay.
Well, what if we just frame it this way? We'll say, since this is the only second tier perspective, we get to have a higher altitude, and all the other ones are nonetheless, even though there may be more complexity and more sophistication in those worldviews, in some sense, they're all first tier. They're all seeing their perspective as, the one and only truth.
Right. We're above those.
That's right.
Only our perspective is the one and only.
That's right. Everybody else is stuck in flatland.
Okay, so I want to talk about your evolution as a progressive, because I was stalking your Facebook page.
Yeah.
And I noticed
I was wondering if we were going to get to this.
I noticed you were a fan of Rachel Maddow.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you went way back.
Well, no. I was just looking at your like your likes and stuff, just to see if anything I could dig up and use against you here.
Yep.
And so you were a fan of Rachel Maddow, and you also did all the profile picture stuff, where you got the rainbow profile picture, you got the Black Lives Matter, all that virtue signaling stuff. So, so how did you go from being a NPC progressive to where you are now?
I hate that term, by the way. So, for me, this is where the post or trans progressive part comes in, right? I think that there are legitimate truths to the progressive worldview. There are legitimate perspectives. There are legitimate values and claims that have to be reckoned with. And, on the sort of, you take the vertical nature out of it, you just put the political spectrum sort of on a line. I tend to be sort of a moderate liberal. And I live in Oakland. I move in a lot of progressive circles. I would say 95% of my friends are, thoroughly progressive. And there are parts of those.
So they think you're a right winger.
They do. That's the strange sign. That's the strange thing. Yeah.
I lived in the East Bay for 10 years.
Oh wow, where?
In the hills of it's like right between Berkeley and Oakland, behind Claremont Canyon.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I have a reputation out there for being, an alt-right neo-Nazi.
Yeah.
Just because I would be like, well, what about this?
Yeah. Did you see my most? I don't know how closely you followed my wall, but there's like a 200 comment conversation that I've been having around Dave Chappelle and the trans issue with my progressive friends. Yeah. So yeah, somehow I'm to the right. And as you say, in the progressive worldview, anyone to the right of you is, could be tarred with a, yeah, exactly.
So talk about your transition to Nazism.
Trajectory. Yeah. Well, so I think there's multiple parts here. So if you had followed me during, the primaries in the run up to the 2020 election, which was before my Black Lives Matter profile picture, for sure. I found myself in the position of arguing with my progressive friends about Bernie Sanders versus other candidates. And, and so I certainly, long before I got involved with the Institute and long before I sort of got involved with this movement, was trying to bring integral principles of balance and left-right perspectives and could see that the left was sort of spinning off into positions that I just didn't feel like were healthy, or certainly
psychosis.
Yeah. So, and I will also say that, I'm sort of an interesting integralist in that, I read Wilbur's books, every single one of them, in my 20s, and was got really into the philosophy, and then, then really focused on for a while, just focused on my career, focused on my friends and my local life. And I wasn't involved in these online sort of discourses around, integral. So then when I get this job, I really dove back into that world. And so in some ways, like, I've got a fresh perspective because I haven't been privy to all of the,
Yeah, you don't have all the mental illness from
yeah,
participating
exactly.
in all the Facebook
the infighting.
wars.
Yeah, exactly. But I also, like, there was also a certain naivete that I've had to spend the last 7 or 8 months kind of getting up to speed on. And, I'll just say that as I got involved with the Institute, and as in that role, I had to expose myself to stuff and read stuff and explore stuff on the right or on the center, or, whatever, that I wasn't necessarily getting. And so, I wouldn't necessarily, if I were to be in those positions again, I don't know how I would respond to, the Black Lives Matter movement or George Floyd's killing from the perspective that I have now, given the things that I've exposed myself to more recently.
Gotcha. Yeah. I decided to move. I moved out of the Bay Area about a year and a half ago. And it's
I didn't realize it was that recently. Yeah.
Yeah. I saw the writing on the wall. There was, the defund the police thing. That was after I left. But there were those kinds of trends happening. Like San Francisco was sort of decriminalizing a lot of stuff. For example, stealing, and which is having the exact effect that you would expect it to.
You would expect it to have. That's right.
They have that social justice district attorney now, who fired like 6 prosecutors as soon as he took the job, and that's having the exact effect that you would expect. So I have a lot of friends that are very progressive, very leftist. And, when I started to sort of like ring the alarm about this stuff, they were just like, what's happening to you? You're becoming this like weird right-wing Nazi guy. And now we're on the same page. Right. Because they are living in it.
Yeah.
They're living in it.
Yeah, we're about to post, probably later today, I'm going to post an article that Carter Phipps just wrote. He's one of our board members. He's the co-founder of the Institute for Cultural Evolution. Yeah, he's in Denver.
And he moved from there.
He moved from California. He moved from Oakland. And so his whole piece is, we all live in California now. And it is essentially exactly what you're saying, which is why he left Oakland. It's also partially about why he came to Oakland in the first place, but it's also about why he left and how sort of progressive governance in the Bay Area is diminishing, diminishing the quality of life that we enjoy out here. So I encourage you to check it out, because I think you'll very much resonate with it as a Bay Area expat.
So what's going to happen there? It's going to become like a gangland. Like it's going to be like Escape from SF.
I don't know. I think there's lots of, I agree with you that it is not moving the right direction, and that there are lots of really troubling political developments. Whether what it actually turns into is, I think there's a little bit of a slippery slope there. But I what I'm most worried about, honestly, is if people vote with their feet and leave, right? The folks who, are well-educated lefty people, but are just sick of trying to step over, human feces on the sidewalk, or whatever their complaint might be. If they leave, then all of a sudden the tax base that makes this a pretty special place leaves, and then you do start to see more of a spiral. I don't necessarily think we're going to get to that. I think there's still lots of great reasons to live in the Bay Area.
Well, big tech is kind of keeping it afloat, it seems
Right,
like.
right. I guess that's what I'm saying. And if that shifts, which it could, then then we might start to move closer to your dystopian projections.
Yeah.
But
That's
I
when I
also
plan to
think that
move
there.
back.
Oh, you want? I see. I thought you were trying to escape the apocalypse.
We're including it as well.
Okay, I see.
So right now I'm focusing on the transcending, and then I want to focus
And
on
then you're going to
including it
include,
next.
yeah, yeah. I mean, what's funny is, and this is going to sound terribly elitist of me, but I certainly see the things that Carter writes about in his article. I see the things that you're describing, and I love where I live, and I love the people who are in my neighborhood, and I've my family has adopted transracially, so I have an African American son, and so there's a value to the diversity that's here for my family that's pretty important. And so there's certainly a lot of downsides, but it's also a pretty amazing place to live, I have to say.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you have one son?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And tell me about that decision.
To adopt?
Yeah.
So
to adopt a African American son.
Yeah. So we adopted him at birth. So we actually matched with his birth mom before he was born. So and ultimately, when you go to adopt, you end up filling out these profiles that say what sort of things you are or not open to. And it has to do with race and different exposures to drugs and alcohol, or different, health conditions and history in the family and things like that. So you fill out a profile. And then when...
How much of a saint are you?
Yeah. I don't consider this to be sainthood by any means.
Not what you did, but I mean, to adopt a child that's been exposed to drugs and alcohol.
Right, exactly. That is the question.
That's the sainthood
that's the sainthood that these ask. And so, but as far as race was concerned, that just wasn't an issue for us. That was not something we were going to limit our choices on.
Great.
Yeah. I'm glad we did.
But it makes me think about the challenges of being a white person, raising a black son. How does he, it's just the kind of questions how does he identify and those kinds of things.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. He's not at the age now where that's really an issue, but
right.
Sooner or later that is going to become not an issue, but it's just going to become a factor of our family. And it's something that we're going to have to really be intentional and thoughtful about how we do that. I mean, we're lucky that we're in really close relationship with his birth mother. So she will be, we text with her every couple days, and, she's now feels like a part of our family. So, she can to some degree help us navigate some of those pieces, but there'll be a lot that we'll just have to figure out on our own. It's a weird way to build a family, but it is pretty cool.
I have a friend in the Bay Area. He's brown, but he's raising a couple white kids. And so he's really concerned about raising white kids in the Bay Area because of this sort of developing anti-white attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if that kind of attitude starts to get more traction, would you want to move or something like that? I mean, what if your kid comes home from high school and he's like, "I hate you. You're white." I mean,
There are,
teenagers will
yeah,
find any
yeah,
reason to hate their parents, but
right, right. Well, and I think in the case of transracial adoption, there are, I've read books about experience of transracial adoptees, and we've, as much as possible, we're trying to expose ourselves to that. It's a pretty normal part of the process. I mean, that is what you describe is frequent in transracial
okay.
families. So I don't know that it's necessarily something that you would only experience now because of the way sort of the progressive view is
Well,
going.
right, but it is, yeah, it's becoming more mainstream, I guess.
Right, right. I think we would, it's just like anything else. You'd have to open up a dialogue and talk about what that means, and have the humility to let your child have their own experience, and also try and give them the perspective that might help them to sort of not lock into that one frame of reference for what our relationship
Yeah.
is to him in terms of race.
So are you studying like how to be less white?
No, I'm not studying how to be less white.
I get accused of like wishing I was black and stuff like that.
Why do you get accused of that?
Um, because I say things like white people are boring, and I listen to a lot of hip hop,
Hip hop, yeah.
and I've internalized a lot of that culture since
Mm-hmm.
I was a
Mm-hmm.
wee lad. So, so yeah, okay. Well, I always encourage white people to integrate more because I found this online somewhere, and I wish I could find it again. I've tried to find it since, but somebody basically said that the American culture, the American culture is a hybrid of like,
Mm-hmm.
white European and African American kind of thing.
Yeah, it was Albert Murray,
It's a
right?
hybrid. Yeah, was it?
Yeah, Omni-Americans.
Omni-Americans. Oh, is that what?
Yeah, yeah,
I thought that
yeah.
was a
His
really interesting take because if you study this culture, this country going back like 50, 60 years, um, I guess with Elvis, it sort of black culture came into the mainstream. And so we are all now like we are a hybrid of black and white.
yeah, yeah, and if not more, right? I mean, I think Murray makes the argument that we're a hybrid of black and white, and that there's these, sort of Native American sort of sensibilities that have made their way into our culture. Of course, a little bit less directly, but I think it's a really compelling argument, and I love that idea. I think that is
Yeah.
honestly that is what I think we should aspire to, is that idea that we're not just sort of homogenizing uh, the culture, that we're trying to keep some of these different cultural threads,
Yeah.
as vibrant parts of our totality.
Yeah. As Americans, we've selected for plenty of, African American cultural values and such.
Yep. Yep.
And so then it's really interesting to then look at the whole woke thing, the awakening to disparities. It's like our identity is part black now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's only natural that we then look at the ways that our culture doesn't value
Mm-hmm.
African Americans. So, so the whole woke thing makes sense in terms of raising awareness of racial disparities, and but I also noticed you've become kind of an outspoken critic of wokeness.
Mhm.
And I think the post-progressive project is a response to that.
Yeah, it's mostly we are mostly right now focused on, in as much of a transcend and include way as we can, pushing back against the progressive worldview's overreach. And we get some flack. We get a lot of flack from folks who are like, well, what about the far right? How come you're not spending as much time, pushing back against the far right? And, I guess what I would say is partially because that's what progressivism itself is doing. And so by trying to transcend and include progressivism, we're trying to, I don't know what the right word is. It sounds very paternalistic as I say it, but
Let's
sort
be
of
paternalistic.
try and realign and reorient progressivism to at least a healthy version of itself. If not, to try and get some progressive folks to actually transcend and include their own worldview and join us.
So this is really interesting. Yeah, I'm curious about the right and how post-progressive integrates right-wing views, or whether it
Mhm.
does.
Well, absolutely it does. I mean, essentially
Or
what
what have
we're
you learned from the right?
uh, it's funny you mention this. I'm working on an article that I want to post that is essentially trying to describe what's an integral or post-progressive right look like. Um, so I'm speaking with some of the folks who are aligned, or affiliated with the Institute for Cultural Evolution, who are right-leaning, and I'm getting their views on that. And I'm going back and reading books about philosophical underpinnings of conservatism. This is Conservatism in America by Clinton Rossiter. Um, and seeing if I can, sort of as a integral, somewhat lefty exercise to try and really codify what is an integral right look like? What does a post-progressive right look like? So I'm in the process of that. But there's lots of things that I have picked up from my reading of the right that I absolutely resonate with and think is valuable. I've got a, I don't know if you consider this right, but I think I've got a, my appreciation for liberal values and the liberal approach to economics, free market has my appreciation of those principles has dramatically, grown. I
Yeah,
think
I saw you lean more economically conservative now.
yeah, I would say that I do.
Well, that's really interesting because a lot of right-wingers now, especially integral right-wingers, they've become highly suspicious of the free market.
I mean, I think all of this stuff is polarities that just spin around each other, right? And this is part of the challenge of defining what a post-progressive right might look like, is because you can try and pin one side of a polarity and say, well, that seems like that's kind of conservative, that's more right oriented. But then as these worldviews and stages develop, they end up flipping, right? So you could say, it feels to me that the right hand position, for example, would be to emphasize rights over responsibilities. So you take the vaccine, right? And whether you right now, at least, the right is emphasizing your right not to take the vaccine, individual rights not to have this thing, sort of put into their body against their will. So it'd be very easy to say, well, then, the liberal side of that is that you are, respecting your sort of responsibilities towards the
The
whole or towards
collective.
others, right? But that, if you go back a stage or two, that's flipped, because traditionally minded sort of conservatives were emphasizing sort of your responsibility to the family and your responsibility to the community and your responsibility to country over your individual rights, which was more of a leftist position. So these polarities flip. And I don't think I think honestly, everybody's trying to grasp with the same thing I'm trying to grasp in writing this article, which is how do you define left or the right now as these different stages? As you look at it through these different stages, it looks very, very different.
Yeah, it changes.
I don't know if that really answers your question, but you were
I'm
talking
just
about
curious if like there's this wave of integral right or meta right, meta right, um, who are very suspicious of free markets, and it's interesting. There is this. It's like there's this argument for the merit of racism.
mm-hmm.
Particularly now that the left is demonizing whiteness, right-wingers seem to respond to that like, okay, I'm being made into an object of hatred. And so it seems like that is catalyzing more racism on the right, that the left is actually making the right more racist in an attempt to make things less racist. So you've got some of these integralists who, for example, fear or feel that whites are being targeted for example, demographic replacement. I'm curious what you would say to that. And whether it makes sense to be racist at a certain point.
Right. In my opinion, no, it does not. It does not justify being racist. I think, I guess here's the part of that argument that I can understand. The argument I can understand is, the far left is making everything about race. It's it is the lens through which everything is being viewed. And so therefore, if you're gonna make that the lens, then I'm gonna use that lens for my particular tribe, and I'm going to use that to differentiate myself and what's unique and important to be celebrated about my culture and my history and all of that. And sure, if you want to do that, that's fine. I don't find that to be particularly sophisticated. I don't feel the need to do that. If you want to, I guess the part about it I can understand is if you want to get in touch with your European cultural heritage, great, go for it. But I don't think that means you have to. I certainly don't think that if once it tips over into any kind of superiority, then I say no. You're not.
Well, you have these
rebalancing. I think
you have these like various European countries which have like they have a long history, a strong cultural identity, and so some right wingers, they view this sort of diversity push as diluting and maybe ultimately destroying their cultural identity. And so, is there a point at which like diversity goes too far and it starts to make sense to want to push back against it to preserve sort of an ethno-national identity?
I don't think. No, I would draw the line. I would use a knife to separate ethno and national identity. So okay. I think I don't think it's
that makes sense here.
Yeah,
in America,
right?
But in other countries, like I don't know, Denmark or something, does that?
You're saying there's not no real separation between ethno and sort of between ethnic identity and national identity, and so is it fair to separate those two? Well, like you can separate it even then by extracting the cultural values as the thing to which you would like immigrants or whomever to some degree to.
So you're talking about transcending, but is it okay to include race?
Yeah, it's okay to include race, but not in your if you're talking, I mean, are we talking immigration in relation to what? Immigration policy? So you shouldn't let people of other races in because they're going to be diluting.
Sure. And I mean, maybe. And also, but like redefining the national identity and what that means.
Right. I'm all for redefining the national identity. I just think there's to tie it to.
Is it okay to redefine the national identity to include, for example, Sharia law?
Well, is it okay? No, not in developed Western countries. It's not. It's not. In a traditional country, absolutely. That's part of the that's part of the sort of ethnocentrism that's baked in to that particular worldview. So, I stand outside of that and say no, it's not
Gotcha.
okay.
Okay, so we're now. So
Yeah.
let's talk about immigration now, because your employer has the same acronym as the Immigration Customs and Enforcement in this
Right.
country.
It does.
Now, you guys could have chose something different.
It's ruined the acronym for us.
You could have chosen like the New Institute for Cultural Evolution, and then you'd be nice.
Oh, there we go. That's exactly what I want to come across.
So what is the? We're getting into like immigration. This is a tricky topic.
Yeah, for sure.
Immigration and who you let in and who you don't. And I suspect the answer you might give is something to do with developmental levels, except you're afraid to actually use stages and levels. So what is the post-progressive approach to immigration?
Well, I encourage everyone who might be listening to this to go to our website, the Post-Progressive Post, post-progressive.org, and check out our issue positions, because I think the first one, we have these series of issue positions that we put out. They're sort of mini policy pieces, and they essentially take a post-progressive approach to these different issues. And our first one was immigration. So a much more comprehensive view of that can be found there. But the part where I will say that where we echo the sentiment that I think you're trying to describe is that we do think that there is a potential danger into unrestricted immigration, in particular from countries that have not established the sort of underpinnings of a liberal democracy. And so, that's a very, very tricky thing to put into an immigration policy, but that we, ideally we want to ensure that that there are things that need to be preserved about a nation's culture and values and way of life. And in this case, like the liberal values, not used in the more classical sense, right? Not in the sort of political spectrum sense, the liberal values that America was founded on, and to which we are still trying to achieve and grow and maintain. There is something to some sort of process for people becoming citizens whereby they are educated and filtered to some degree for those liberal values.
I see. So
that's a small part of the immigration issue position, but to address the sort of question I think you were trying to get at, yeah. I think that the sad fact is that the truth of the matter is many of the people who are attracted to the United States as immigrants in the first place are coming because of those liberal values. So I don't know that necessarily has to be some indoctrination camp that we make all people applying for citizenship go through, because I think there's already a filter that is happening when people want to immigrate here, is that they want the opportunity, the economic freedom and the economic opportunity that's provided here. They want the safety, but they also want the liberal values, the freedom, to. Yeah. So I think there's already there's already some filtering that naturally happens as a result of that. Now, as conditions in Central and South America get worse and worse and worse, then you start to have to worry about that because those folks are not coming because they're reaching for the sort of values that we uphold.
Pure survival.
It's just survival. They're just trying to escape the atrocities that are going on in the places where they come from. So it gets complicated. There's no easy. This is the thing that actually kind of bothers me about a lot of the discourse that's going on in the sort of integral circles online is that we, of all folks, should be recognizing that these are complex problems that do not have easy solutions. They require, discernment and balancing different polarities and approaches. They're just not simple. And anyone who's oversimplifying these challenges is, in my mind, not really living up to what we're being asked of as integralists.
Yeah. I like that you, on your website, you make arguments you have post-progressive persuasion strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And you make arguments to progressives, to modernists, and to traditionalists.
Yep.
So are you actually able to successfully persuade people and at these different stages and of your...
Well, it's an open experiment. I mean, we've only been, doing this for quite a while. I think we are the sort of first wave of people who are interested in what we're doing were people who are already in sort of integral world already. So, where that puts them on the political spectrum still varies, but at least they were sort of familiar with the concepts. I think that the question that's still out there for us is what happens if your, average fiscal conservative just happens to wander onto the site and take, and take the post-progressive test or go to one of those sort of portal pages that we've got for the different worldviews and see whether they resonate with it. I mean, again, part of our theory is that you don't have to buy the whole package to be able to get the gist of what it is this perspective brings and to be able to apply it in your daily, life and in your politics.
So it seems like you're just trying to shift or expand what people see as possible.
Yep.
Given their current vantage point.
Yep, exactly. And to see, on one of our pages, we've got these quadrants, not to be confused with the four quadrants, but we've got this quadrants basically, which is the upside of each of these four different value systems, and the downside of each of these four different value systems, right? The potential negatives and the positive values and goals. I think if your average sort of politically astute, non-integral person were to take a good look at those and really spend some time digesting it and realizing, starting to use that very oversimplified map, but map nonetheless, and apply it to what they're seeing out there in the political and culture war, I think just that can go a long way, because it if you get it, it means that you are you now have a framework for valorizing the viewpoints of your opponents, even if you don't shift towards those viewpoints, just to be able to see the way it fits in, what it brings to the table, how it counterbalances potentially your values and your perspectives. If you can really get that, you've gone a long way to be able to, in my mind, go back out there and potentially interact with somebody who disagrees with you in a different way. So that's part of our theory, is that there's a little bit of a psychoactive, ability for these maps to help people, recontextualize their arguments. Now, the counter argument to that is the shit show debates that are taking place on Integral Global around politics. That people who have these maps, who supposedly understand that there's a truth represented by each of these different positions and places on the political spectrum, still go at it like they just there are many people who just bring the culture war to the integral debate, and frustrated by that.
Yeah, and I guess I would explain that by saying they feel like there's something really big being left out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, particularly the right.
You're right. Yeah.
There's something big being left out. So rather than push for integral solutions per se, they're going to represent what's being left out and sort of
Yeah.
dig in their heels until they can get other people to take that more seriously.
Yeah. I can see that. I mean, one of the principles that we are trying to use at the Institute of Cultural Evolution and with the Post Progressive Project in general is that ideally, we want to be able to speak for the voices that are not at the particular table, right? And so in the case of some of the dialogues we're having, there are a lot of people who are either still progressive or coming from progressivism as part of their, pathway to post-progressivism. And so their challenges you have to understand and be able to speak to in certain circumstances, the values of the right, the perspective of the right, the, important truths of the right. I've taken that, as much as I can. I'm trying to do that. And the more you do that, the more you potentially end up with a healthy version of the right. But yeah, I hear you though. That's a good justification for why people are being so seemingly uni-perspective.
See, I can rationalize anything. Any regression you want. So yeah, I'm looking at this value polarities reveal the four Americas.
Yeah.
Now this is interesting. I think where did this come from?
The four Americas came from, all of a sudden I'm blanking on his name, George Packer, who wrote a book, and then he wrote a really, really lengthy sort of article that was kind of a synopsis of
in the Atlantic.
In the Atlantic.
I shared that earlier this year.
Yeah. And he kind of, interestingly, it was funny. I was watching my son in the morning, and I'm kind of just flipping through on my phone, and I go to the Atlantic, and I see that article, and I was like, oh my God, he totally just, sort of independently settled on the exact same four value systems that we have identified. And so I texted Steve, and he was literally texting it back to me at the exact same time. We both found it. So it's pretty interesting and unique in that it's not somebody who is coming from the integral world, has been exposed to any of these maps, but sort of independently saw how these four, he calls them four narratives, or four, he sees them as narratives. But it was pretty interesting how well it overlapped with these value systems that we've identified.
Yeah, so you've got caring values,
mm-hmm.
and that's oriented towards a just America.
Mm-hmm.
Fairness values for a smart America.
Mm-hmm.
Liberty values towards a free America, and heritage values towards a real America.
Right.
So tell me, why is fairness values a smart America?
So, so when you're looking at those four, sort of value systems, what you're looking essentially at, traditionalism is the heritage values,
right,
and then modernism is split between liberty values and fairness values. So those are together one worldview, but they're kind of the left and the right hand side of the modern worldview, and then you've got the progressive worldview. Does that make sense?
So what is the fairness aspect of
the fairness is the fairness aspect is like, it's like progressivism light. It's like if the sort of libertarian right or the fiscally conservative right is sort of emphasizing freedom and market freedom and individual freedom, that the sort of modern left is focused on your respect to the collective, trying to trying to improve schools, improve social welfare, and so it's the sort of moderate version of the left, I guess what I would say, and it really skews towards
Trying
the
to
sort of
balance equality with meritocracy, maybe.
exactly right, yeah. Although both liberty values and fairness values are both pretty meritocratic, but they're sort of, I guess I would say you're right, that they're balancing those two pieces from within that. I would say they're trying to balance libertarian values with equality values.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah.
Well, a libertarian would define fairness as freedom, and whereas a liberal modernist, as you put it, would value more merit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Like competency over pure liberty or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. And and Packer does a really good job of describing that particular narrative, the smart America, as being really meritocratic. And what's interesting is that really is his that's his worldview. Like, so it's interesting to sort of read that article and recognize that that's ultimately where his allegiance lies. He can see enough of what the problems with it are, and he can see how it created, the backlash of real America and the backlash of just America because of that kind of meritocratic push and how many people are left out of that.
That's cool. So let's talk about nationalism.
Okay.
Because coming from a progressive area in politics and worldview, nationalism is kind of like a dirty word.
Yep.
So I'm curious about your own trajectory with regards to nationalism.
Yeah, I think my trajectory has been similar to my trajectory in a lot of these other issues, right? In the sense that, like, there was a period where I felt like, sort of the international order and, not necessarily globalism, but the idea that, like, we're moving towards this sort of larger identity as a global citizen was really attractive to me. And I think it still is to a great degree, but I've also come to have a much more greater appreciation for the power of nationalism and how it's a necessary. Steve actually in one of the articles that he's written sort of points out that nationalism and globalism are themselves a polarity that shouldn't be just destroyed, with one side over the other. So, and I largely agree with that. I think, I think the thing sounds. I mean, it seems petty in regards to all the other stuff that progressivism is pushing right now. But the part that bothers me the most is that there's no sense of national pride, no sense of patriotism, no sense that, like, we're trying to do something in this country by integrating all these different, folks from all these different places and nationalities and cultures and backgrounds that no other country on the planet is trying to do. And that there's great value to doing that. There's great value to trying to integrate those. And so I think that is where progressivism is sort of, there are quite a few signs that there are many people of color who are leaving sort of the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And and I sort of think of those generally as some of the older generations of different racial groups are leaving because they are patriots. they've come to take on the values of the American, dream, and they don't want to see it shit on. So if there's one thing that I think progressivism could do to get itself on the healthier side and actually contribute is to embrace a nationalistic vision for what a pluralistic liberal society looks like.
Yeah. Because a lot of people explain the rise of Trump as a reaction to globalism.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's been like sending a lot of like manufacturing jobs overseas and sort of selling out Americans for the global order,
Yep.
the New World
Yep.
Order.
Yep. Agreed. And I just think that you know, we can only be a force, the United States can only be a force for good in the world if we are strong and healthy and economically, you know, that we've got all of our engines firing. Then we have the resources to be able to go out and try and, you know, positively impact other countries. But yeah, you can't do that without focusing on making sure that you know, your unemployment is low and people have ladders of opportunity, and you know that there's this engine going that we can then share some of the wealth.
So, you know, Corey DeVos, Integral Life, he has this idea to save the world. I mean, to fix the country, which is to reinstate the draft. Make it 100% mandatory, convert it into a National Guard / Peace Corps type of thing, and train every American to use and respect firearms. What do you think of that idea?
It's mandatory, like they do in Israel or something like that. Like even before you go off to college, you have to do this.
It's a sort of a national civil service thing. You know, he said you would force rich kids, poor kids, white kids, black kids, etc., to get off their screens, out of their hometowns, put them in the trenches of civil service for a couple years, and he said he thinks a lot of our problems would go away within a generation. Keep our guns, get them out of the shadows of fear and fetishization, and reconnect to our primordial American martial culture. So that's martial as in MARTIAL.
Right.
Not my culture.
Not your own culture that you've set for the United States. I think it's an interesting idea. I do think I mean, you know, there are all sorts of arguments that could be made against it from, you know, again, the sort of libertarian perspective. But
yeah, so this go ahead.
Well, but what I would say is would that would that go a long way to solve some of the polarization issues that we're experiencing? I think absolutely. I think part of it, you know, I had this. I'm gonna make a circuitous answer to this. So that thing on my wall, that conversation on my wall around trans folks and Dave Chappelle that I mentioned, I had this sort of new integral friend that I met online. He was looking through it and said, "Hey, you did a really good job of sort of like staying in yourself and being sympathetic to the arguments of your progressive friends on this, but also sort of being clear." And I realized the reason for that is because these were my friends, but because the progressive people I was arguing with in this particular case were people who I knew, and you know, even if not necessarily super close with, like I knew them. I knew I was going to interact with them in the future, and so there was a reason for me to sort of engage with them in a way that was respectful, but held my line, tried to introduce new all this stuff. And that's the problem. That's the entire problem with the way that we're having all these arguments is we can throw whatever we want to over the fence of Facebook, and it's never going to come back to bite us. We're not actually in relation to these people. If I, piss somebody off online and write them off, they write me off. There's no consequence to that. And that's not it's not healthy. It's not natural. It's not how human beings evolved to relate, is to, to be able to just throw whatever out there and not have it come back to you because
Yeah,
you're
so this
in the
is
same
really
community with that
interesting.
person. Yeah.
You have like a shared reality, a shared heart space with the people that you're engaging with, and that provides a sort of a counterbalance to the polarized views, let's say.
Yeah.
People are more willing to stick around and give you the benefit of the doubt and open their mind and their heart to you. And you've got some incentive to kind of give them the benefit of the doubt and be receptive and compassionate and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And so the internet has created this like bizarre place where you can engage in political discussions with people you don't give a shit about, and it's just driving polarization.
Yep.
So I guess part of the advice here is like, don't engage with people you don't give a shit about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so you got these dudes going into like integral global and lecturing the group, and lecturing people they don't give a shit about.
Yep. Because they're not actually in relationship with them. And so, to bring it back to Corey's idea, I think there's value in forming communities with Americans from different, belief systems and parts of the country and, communities, and having to do something constructive with them where you can't just you can't turn them into a political abstraction. Right. And so I don't know how we solve that, because things are only going to be more and more online, but that's the sort of kernel of truth. Not, I'm sure there's more truth to it than just the kernel, but I'm saying that's one of the pieces that jumps out to me as being really positive about that idea is we're just not actually interacting with each other in such a way that we're going to learn from each other in most of these cases.
Yeah. So you brought up your objection was, of course, libertarians would lose their shit over something like that.
Right.
Which kind of, it started to make me wonder, like, do you see your organization as more, let's say, Teal centered or Turquoise centered?
So Steve's take on this, and I think it's a good one, is that all this talk of turquoise,
we're both.
No, I wouldn't say that. He wouldn't say that. He would say the entire idea of turquoise is bullshit. Like, at least as the way these, that there might be few individuals who are operating at something that's post-Teal, right? But that they are so few and far between that it hasn't actually settled into a worldview that could be meaningfully described, constructed. That these worldviews themselves form in response to the previous one to solve the problems that the previous one couldn't solve. And so
what
we're
problems
just
are we creating?
At Teal, you mean?
Yeah.
I would think, and this is all just speculation, right? I mean, we've got our spiral dynamics maps and all that, but I think the problems that we're creating it's like the final limitations of being an individual. Like, to me, whatever comes after this transcends individualism to such a degree that it's this Teal is the last stand of the ego, is I guess what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Teal could be the. Sometimes I think of it as like the cognitive green.
Mm-hmm.
Like a cognitive individualist green.
Mm-hmm.
Because we want to be inclusive, but now it's more about perspectives.
Right. Exactly.
Which kind of does away with the whole first tier versus second tier thing. And there also seems to be a kind of libertarian ethos at Teal.
Yep. Agreed.
And so I'm wondering then,
Yeah.
if is integral really is it really transcending authoritarianism, or do we come back to that for a kind of benevolent philosopher king dictatorship
Philosopher King.
at Turquoise? Which is kind of like, I mean, the move Corey wants to make is sort of, it looks very
it is very Philosopher
authoritarian.
Kingish. Yeah, totally. Totally. Um, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think there's a lot of, I mean, it's an enticing idea. The idea of the Philosopher King is an enticing idea, and you can see how a developmental perspective might lead you to that conclusion, because you're saying, well, there's this, like, just by the nature of, greater depth, less span, there's going to be some point on the top of that kind of perspectival triangle, pyramid, that is going to be infinitely more capable of sort of guiding the spiral
Well, you're
from the
making
top.
that argument implicitly by saying, like, oh, we're the Institute for Cultural Evolution. We know what evolution looks like and where things need to go. And, I mean, would the world, if ICE could be elected dictator, would everything improve?
um, I don't even. I think we would create as many problems as we solved by doing that.
That's the humble take.
And I guess what I would
What's
say,
the
here's
opposite
my
polarity of the humble?
here's what I'll say. We're actually right now, as an organization, we're not focused on what's next. Like, there's a couple superpowers that you have at second tier. There's a couple superpowers that you have in the sort of integral meta perspective. And the one that we are emphasizing the most is the ability to see and align the values of the previous worldviews. We're not pointing like, here's where we need to go, and here's what it's going to look like, and here's the 150 new innovative solutions we have for how to fix society. There's plenty of people in the integral world who are doing that. And I think it's good. It's of limited value right now, because if we can't solve the polarization and the culture war from actually turning into a civil war, we're never going to get to any of those, nice, creative, pie in the sky, innovative, integral ideas. So we are using the integral perspective to do the hard work of actually trying to integrate and align the culture and the problems that are currently at the forefront. So that's our main message, because that's what has to happen before anything else really gets put on the table
We
as
have
a possible solution.
Transcend perspectival polarization.
Yeah.
And if we don't do that, you see civil war as inevitable?
I mean, that's putting it strong. I wouldn't say inevitable, but it's certainly a distinct possibility.
Okay. What if Eros, or spirit in action, wants that? What if it wants a civil war?
Then it will have a civil war.
And we shouldn't try to stop it.
Well, that's not how it works.
We should actually be encouraging it.
Well, if you believe that was actually the right thing to do, but
I always have to say something that'll get this show potentially banned from YouTube. So
right, that's right. We got to be canceled somehow. If you think spirit wants it is the reason to do it, then that's not the reason to do it. You should do it because you think it's the right and necessary thing to do, and hope that you're in alignment with spirit and action. Carter and I were talking about this recently, that there's certainly a way in which the birth of a new stage or a new worldview in human history has often required a revolutionary sort of pushback against the old. Our working theory is that perhaps the integral worldview is the first one that doesn't have to do that. That it truly, because it can transcend and include the previous perspectives, that it may not be necessary to burn down the old in order to make enough space for the new.
But it can't outcompete like amber. Amber always wins. It's almost like integral has to become amber or something like that.
Yeah, I think I've been reading Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge. Have you heard of it?
No.
He also wrote I'm forgetting the name of his other book. Anyway, it's sort of it's thoroughly modernist document. It's a thoroughly orange document. It basically talks about sort of the revolution that modernity brought about in liberal values, essentially applied in three realms: in politics, in economics, and in essentially knowledge production or science. And so it's a really strong it's a really strong support for liberal values. And he opens the book by describing Plato's, we all sort of hear about Plato's writings about the philosopher king, but when he quotes larger chunks of the Republic and what that actually looks like. And, again, I haven't gone back to the original source material. I have no reason to believe that he's misrepresenting it, but it is about totalitarian approach to leadership that you've ever heard. And it's a persuasive argument. Rauch makes a very persuasive argument that that is not the way that society evolves. That the hidden hand of individual self-interest is the most dynamic sort of system for approximating, for discovering truth, for governing society, and for the allocation and exchange of resources. And it's a very compelling argument. So right now, at least, I am not on the authoritarian philosopher king side of the street. I still believe that the free exchange of ideas and perspectives is the best way for society to evolve.
I see. So I guess
I could be wrong. It could.
Orange obviously does outcompete amber.
Mm-hmm. In that sense.
But it also doesn't give a shit about a lot of other things
that are important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
But again, like all this stuff, all the tribalism that we're experiencing now, it's like an amber regression.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I hear that. I've noticed that there's this, like, whenever these Facebook debates in the integral sort of world get really, really heated, somebody starts trotting out, "Oh, your position is so amber," and I don't know. Is that true? Are people really regressing that far, or are they just doing a sort of natural thing when your perspective gets challenged and you've worked hard to construct it? Like, are they actually, regressing, or is this just what green? This is just, to me, this is just the challenge of green. Like, we're in multi-perspectival overload.
Yeah, we're in fragmentation.
Yeah, yeah.
Mini narratives, tribes. Right. Organizing around mini narratives, which necessarily brings in this kind of amber. It's like, well, you're either with our views or you're against them or outside them.
Yep. And I've heard, again, I hate to keep like sort of pointing to the same thing, but in some of these arguments, right? One of the things you'll hear is, oh, that's so amber. There's so many people who are behaving amber in this conversation or coming from amber in this conversation, even though they think they're coming from something else. And then the other thing that occasionally just gets thrown out there left and right is evil. Oh, that's evil. It's such an evil perspective. I can't believe that, and, I'm not saying it's like all over the place, but I inevitably in some of these conversations, it gets down to this idea that like, that Trump or Biden, is ultimately enacting an evil worldview that like is da da da. And I just, that's where, sure, you may be arguing for a point on the spectrum that's not being heard and integrated to take your argument, but that to me is both of those moves are pretty fundamental, like misunderstanding of what actually putting integral into practice looks like. And half the time in some of these arguments, I just find myself not trying to argue for a particular point of view, but just to sort of request a little bit of moral humility from the person who I'm in conversation with, right? Just have a little bit of humility that like, you might be exaggerating the scenario.
Epistemic humility.
Yeah, epistemic humility, exactly. Yeah.
And how does that go over?
Not terribly well. I think one time I got somebody to, take a step back and say, okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, that seems to be the big problem these days, is epistemic humility, or the lack of it.
It's a huge problem. In my opinion, it is the problem that post-progressive or integral worldview is here to solve.
To point out that there are excluded truths from people's worldviews.
Yep.
So did you ever read the Memetic Tribes, Culture War 2.0?
No, I didn't.
Man, how are you fighting culture war and you're...
I've got a lot of reading to do with my new job. It's hard to, especially
That's
with
a really good one,
an infant son.
It's very integral. Peter Limberg has mapped out like dozens, over a few years ago, over like 36 of these Memetic tribes.
Wow.
That are all at each other's throat. And so it doesn't even make sense to talk about progressives. You've got, because there are different categories, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm just going to read through some of these. You got social justice activists. And he maps out the telos, the sacred values, the master status, like what somebody becomes when they're a master. Existential threats, combatants. Each Memetic tribe has several other Memetic tribes that they're fighting. So you got social justice activists, you got Black Lives Matter, you got Me Too, gender critical feminists, modern neo-Marxists, Antifa, Occupy, Dirtbag Left.
What's the Dirtbag Left?
Well, like Chapo Trap House?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's an example. They value economic justice and progress. Here's what he says. Dirtbag Left. Telos is to overtake and revitalize the left. They're unapologetic socialists. In contrast to the democratic socialists, which are democratic.
Right.
They're more the hardcore socialists.
Right.
In contrast to the neo-Marxists, who are aimed at the destruction of false consciousness. So they're fighting for more, they're revolutionaries, fighting for class consciousness. Versus, which I guess is more like in sort of an epistemic aim or epistemological aim. Whereas the Dirtbag Left and the democratic socialists are fighting more for lower right values, economic justice.
So those are just the memes on the far left.
Yeah. Then then on top of that, the establishment left, which is the liberal.
Okay. Right.
So we've got here 11 distinctly leftist Memetic tribes who are now all fighting with each other.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the establishment left or the liberals, they're getting attacked by, left and right. They're getting attacked left and right. But they're getting attacked by the left for all kinds of reasons. Liberalism, is under attack. So, so that's like the left culture war.
Right.
And it's really interesting to see like the way the feminists and the race conscious tribes are getting
And then
into
the gender in
arguments.
particular now too. Yeah.
Yeah, and now
In
you've got
terms of
like
trans, right? Yeah.
trans versus the feminists. The feminists say, and there's even wars among trans people. Okay, between
Yeah.
the non-binaries, the gender
Mm-hmm.
non-binaries, and
Mm-hmm.
what they call the transmedicalists. And the transmedicalists say only somebody that has medically transitioned is a true trans person. And if so the word transsexual now
Mm-hmm.
is a sign that if you use that word, you're what they call true scum. Okay.
This is what the medical.
The non-binaries.
Okay. Okay.
They're saying you don't have to medically transition.
Mm-hmm.
And if you use a word like transsexual, then you are somebody who believes that only a person who has medically transitioned is a true trans person. Okay, so now there's all this fighting amongst trans people over what's a real trans person.
Yep. No, you're right. It's
And
total fracturing. It's just fracturing.
ContraPoints?
No. ContraPoints. Is that a site?
ContraPoints is this it's this great YouTube show by a trans person, Natalie Wynn, who basically got labeled as true scum and got attacked by all these trans people. And she devotes this whole show to it.
Huh. I'll have to check it out.
You can understand the trans debate by watching her video on that topic. So anyway, so the culture war gets really granular.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
And then you've got all these right wingers, or right wingers like Christian right, establishment right, Tea Party, Trumpists, info warriors, QAnoners, alt right, alt light, modern neo Nazis, neo reactionaries, men's rights advocates, the manosphere, men going their own way, and the incels.
Incels.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where it says their telos is enforced monogamy through a beta uprising. So this is really interesting. Right. I've talked on this show about the sexual marketplace and how recent cultural changes have made it harder for betas to get laid. And so now they've formed this whole identity group.
Yeah, it's crazy. Really interesting.
Yeah, so it doesn't even make sense to talk about progressive, modernist and traditional.
Well, so here's my pushback against that. So you listed, just on the left, whatever it was, 10 groups, 10 groups plus one that was like the mainstream left, right? My argument would be that if you did a population count of people who were in each of those different, memetic tribes, and you could somehow realistically ascertain whether or not they're, a part of that group or not, that all those 10 that you listed might make up 5% tops of the American population, right? And that the mainstream left might make up 25% of the population or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that it's just because there are these little niched out sort of perspectives or identities doesn't necessarily preclude you from zooming out and seeing that they're all part of the far, far left and are some sort of subset of the progressive worldview. And that for most intents and purposes, you can still use the progressive worldview as a definable sort of meta container for all of those different ideologies within it.
I hear you. So Peter Limberg argues for like memetic mediation.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody that can like get down and dirty into the nitty gritty and mediate between all these different memetic tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And so he kind of sees that as the way to facilitate epistemic humility.
Mm-hmm.
As a way to get people to understand other of these granular tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of that's how we're going to develop more cohesion, is by getting into the granular, whereas you're more into like the meta.
Yeah, zooming out. Yep, I would agree. I think that is, and this is why, I don't agree necessarily that the way to do that is to sort of have this mediation between all these different micro tribes. For one, I would say, like, what does that look like? Are you doing that online? Or are you in person? So let's assume that it's in person. If it's in person, you're actually like, there's some reason to try and build a coalition between 2 or 3 of these different splintered kind of identities. Getting them in the room and having them be working on something that they have a vested interest in, trying to sort of address their grievances for the purpose of whatever it is. That's half the battle as it is. And by just having people be in the same space, and again, all of a sudden the political abstraction is, they're not being political abstractions. It's a real person with a real perspective and a real history and a real, whatever. And, it's easy enough to find empathy there. I just don't know that actually translates when those people go back to their worlds or go back online or back to whatever their activism. That doesn't translate to them suddenly saying, oh, well, this sort of splinter group, I realize they're real people and we share lots of values and we share lots of things as human beings who are struggling and da-da-da. Therefore, I'm going to now go and I'm going to extend that same empathy to the Christian fundamentalist who's voting for Trump because they believe that abortion is the most important issue. Like, it doesn't translate to the rest of their life. And so our theory, it's a working theory, is that these maps, again, if you can grok them, if you really can spend the time to understand them and seeing how you fit into them and seeing how everyone else is sort of like playing their part, can go further in helping you to recognize that your particular truth claims are that you need to have some epistemic humility around them because other people feel just as strongly and have a world of experiences that back up their particular perspective that contains truth and value as well. I mean, it sounds, again, people would call that meta hovering, but I think that's part of what that's part of what we're trying to do here in this worldview, is to be able to zoom out enough to recognize that, like, we don't want to just be a part of the culture war.
Meta hovering. Now that's an interesting concept. Have you been accused of that?
People, I have been accused of that. Yes, actually.
And do you think there's any merit to it?
I do think there's merit to it. True and partial. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's easy, it's easy from my particular perch to float above the argument and see how it all shapes up and to not have to take a stand. I do take a stand. I do. If you ask me to come down on a particular position, I'll think about it and I'll make a position. I don't think you can stay constantly sort of hovered above the perspectives. You have to go back in and take a position, but that doesn't mean you have to lose the overall view or the validity of the person on the other side when
Right.
you go to take a position.
Yeah, that seems to be like the trap of Teal is like something like, let me get back to you later after I after I've examined all the nuances and all the
Right.
perspectives and all the stages and all the types. Let
Yeah,
me get back to
totally.
you later.
Yep.
And so maybe Turquoise is just like Teal people that have finally made up their mind.
Yeah, maybe.
I
But it'd be easy
personally,
to,
yeah, go ahead.
you have to go through that too, though, right? Like you can't, you know, there's a pre-trans fallacy somewhere there as well, where if somebody's just because someone's taking a principled stand on something and they understand integral theory doesn't necessarily mean that they are, turquoise or whatever, that they have, kind of transcended the meta hovering. Like you have to do the meta hovering too, before you come back down and try and take a position.
I gotcha. Back to the question of like, is Teal just really a cognitive green? Because it seems like quote unquote integral or Teal people, often seem to miss, they lack that green heart
Mm-hmm.
orientation to the point that it has to be developed or something like that, right? Like it's almost like again, it's just Teal is really just another part of polarity.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
green, it's individualistic cognitive green in contrast to more of a heart-centered collective green,
Mm-hmm.
which is what the usual green is thought of as.
Right. Right. I think there's I think there's a good argument to be made there. I am not ultimately persuaded by that argument, but I see the argument.
Because
You
you're
know,
invested in your superiority
well,
as an integralist.
exactly. I think I think the stuff gets really, really complicated when you were trying to judge where someone is at. And honestly, that includes oneself. Like once you see this map and you really grok it and you get it, then the ability to see where you or anyone else is on that is just not a straightforward thing. And I think there's a good, I'll try and bracket it. So let me just talk about that for a second, then we'll come back to sort of whether or not Teal is just a sort of cognitive green, because I think it's an interesting question. But in terms of being able to self-assess or assess others about where they are in their sort of developmental journey on this, I think there's multiple factors involved. And, you'll have to forgive me for continually referencing Steve's work, but in Integral Consciousness, Steve sort of he unpacks this idea of the center of gravity, of where you are at on a particular stage, the center of gravity, by introducing the idea that there's sort of three, rather than there being 10 or 12 or 24 different developmental lines, and identity being one of them, that there's these three sort of meta developmental lines that contain other sublines within them. And I think, this is pretty abstract, but I think it's worth exploring because I think it brings something new to the table. So his idea is that you have, the sort of self is primarily, there's the cognitive line, there's the emotional, intelligence line, and then there's what he would call the volitional intelligence line. And so it's basically like, the cognitive line determines your thinking, the emotional line determines your feeling, and the volitional line determines your doing. Like, how do you translate, what you think and feel? How do you act on it? How do you behave? How do you actually sort of apply it in the real world? And so to me, like, to get integral, all you have to do is have your cognitive line be far enough developed that you can understand the concepts and you can sort of apply that screen to the world. But that to me is insufficient to actually be coming from or have your center of gravity at that level. And so part of that is like the emotional part. To me, the emotional intelligence is an introspective capacity, right? It's like the ability to turn within yourself and see, what you're feeling, how what you're feeling might be shaping what you're thinking, or right. So you're sort of, the emotional intelligence is the ability to sort of go meta on your own interior sort of states. And then the volitional intelligence is the ability to sort of mix those two and apply them in really like in ways that are congruent with your understanding, right? So to me, I see in Integral Global and a lot of these places, I see a lot of people whose cognitive lines are through the roof. They get the stuff on an abstract intellectual level, but they don't have the emotional intelligence and they don't have the volitional intelligence to actually have their behaviors and the way that they converse with other people able to sort of keep up with that. And so, it's probably oversimplified, but I think that that's what you're seeing oftentimes is you're seeing people at different, stages of growth in those different sort of meta lines. So to come back to the idea of like, is Teal just cognitive green? I think, maybe it is, right?
We got two types, right? You got one person who's advanced in the cognitive line, but not in the emotional line. And then the other side, you've got advanced in the emotional line, but not in the cognitive line.
Yep. I do think though that there's an integrative, I guess you can call green sort of holistic in that sense, right? So in that sense, it is, you look at the way green approaches spirituality and it's just sort of like smorgasbord, like, it's all true. I'll take any of these parts and I'll have this practice and I'll have this practice or whatever. So in that sense, it's kind of integral in the sense that it's multi-perspectival, but I don't think it's actually integrating those perspectives and finding what's true or relatively true about those perspectives in the way that true Teal is. So I would say that there's definitely a capacity there that I don't see. Tom Warner calls it like early postmodern and late postmodern or something like that. And I think that's an interesting distinction, right? It sort of breaks it into one category that contains this sort of like proto version, which is green, and then this sort of later version, which is yellow. Sure, maybe that's how it ends up planning out to be. It's hard to say because Teal's just now emerging. We don't know whether it's, is it itself a distinct worldview or is it a mature version of postmodernism? We don't know yet, but I think there's enough of a capacity difference between those two to call them distinct stages.
Okay.
But I also think there's a lot of people who are self-describing themselves as Teal who are not, because ultimately they've only grasped it intellectually. They don't have the introspective skills or the like ability to translate that into their actions and behaviors sufficiently.
Yeah, the reason I'm putting forth this argument isn't because I think it's true, but because I think it has positive effects to consider. Well, maybe I'm not, higher development or right. It sort of highlights the lack in the sort of cognitive Teal person.
I think that's a good reason to sort of explore that possibility in oneself.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned spirituality. So what's your spiritual orientation?
I would describe myself as a non-dualist. My spiritual teacher is Rupert Spira. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think I attended one of his talks in the Bay.
Yeah, I've been to a few of his retreats, and he just feels like the real deal to me. I think he's, for a Vedantist, he's a pretty integrated personality. I think he's got, he's pretty in touch on a heart level too. I think he's pretty rational person as well. I think he's a beautiful thinker in addition to having a pretty amazing spiritual realization. So, my practice is being aware of being aware as often and as long as I can consciously do so. And that's my spiritual worldview.
I see. Yeah. The
That's more
non-dual
my practice. It's not my worldview, but it's the practice. Yeah.
I gotcha. Yeah, the non-dualism sort of became like the biggest thing after Buddhism. It seems
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of people were sort of es- desperate to escape nihilism,
Mm-hmm.
of the sort of postmodern nihilism, modern and postmodern. Um, but they rejected Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
and so they sort of escaped into Buddhism for a while,
Mm-hmm.
American Buddhism. And then the next thing after that was like non-dualism.
Mm-hmm.
And all this like Neo-Advaita type stuff
Right.
became really
Right.
popular. And like the denial of the individual consciousness. It's all just, there's nobody here, right?
Yeah.
There's nobody
That's not my
here.
take, by the way.
So, so there's a lot of that like stuff going on in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. I mean, I am a I consider myself a non-dualist and a panentheist at the same time. Like, I don't think, I don't believe in the sort of,
Did you
I
say
don't resonate with it.
pantheist or
Panentheist.
what is that?
Panentheist is the belief that, like, you know, uh, all beings are a part of God, but not the sum of God. So God is not the collective totality of all beings. There's something beyond that collective that is God. So it sort of transcends and includes all the beings in the universe, in the cosmos, but is also not just the sum of those. So, I think Aurobindo was ultimately a panentheist, and it's sort of his ideas is all in God, all as God, all in as I'm forgetting the third one.
In, as, with, through, over, under.
In as I don't remember the third one. It'll of course come to me as soon as we're done. But the idea, that's an idea I ascribe to, and I don't think the idea of this sort of the nobody's home, nobody's here. Non-dualism is not super attractive to me. I think each of us is a refraction of the same singular consciousness, but that there are meaningful distinctions to be made in our individual and their
So are
individual
we gods?
consciousness. I prefer the rather than like rather than the frame of like I am God. I like the God is me frame, sense that like I think the I am God frame
No,
is
I am God.
problematic.
That's problematic.
Right, exactly.
I
That's
am
what I'm
a
saying.
God.
I am a God. Sure, sure.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's better than being this like limited meat sack,
Exactly.
you know.
Yep.
Um, did you ever read Jed McKenna?
Never did. I mean, I've read a few things like on the internet, but not like a whole book.
Okay, because he's an example of one of these non-dualists who is so obviously trapped in dualism. Because he says like, "Oh, reality is just a dream, and all there is consciousness."
Yep.
It's like, "Oh, really? You're gonna divide reality and consciousness into two?"
Right. Right.
So, okay, we're getting close to 2 hours here.
Oh wow,
Yeah,
this has
time
been fun.
flies. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I notice you have a lot of books behind you,
Yeah, I do.
um, which makes you seem pretty smart. What do you read about when you're not reading about integral political cultural stuff?
Well, these days, not much because, like I said, got a
Right.
1.5-year-old,
You're getting
so my time
paid.
to read is yeah, and then there's a lot of stuff that I need to read just to be able to do my job well. But I will say that for fiction goes, I actually like fantasy. And I'm pretty excited about my favorite fantasy series that's going to be coming out, the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. It's going to be coming out as a Netflix, not Netflix, Amazon Prime show coming out in, I think, another, like maybe later this month. So I'm pretty stoked about that.
Ooh, and what do you like about Wheel of Time?
Have you, have you ever read it?
I've never even heard of it, I think.
It's crazy series. It's like 14 books or something like that. The author Robert Jordan died before he was able to finish the series, and Brandon Sanderson, another science fiction or fantasy science fiction writer, ended up getting the notes from Robert Jordan's wife, and then ended up writing the last 3 books of the series, and did a fantastic job doing it. Um,
Wow.
it started off as this sort of like, I think when I was younger and I read fantasy, it was this sort of escape and, sort of swords and sorcerers and all that kind of stuff. But the Wheel of Time series has some pretty powerful spiritual overtones and undertones in it that are really, really well done, complex storytelling, um, incredible worlds, just the sort of the world that this fantasy series is set in is like really, really cool and different and interesting, kind of a different take on the fantasy world genre. So I don't know, it's just a good escape, and it sort of yeah, I have to say that the sort of spiritual undertones are probably what I like most about it.
Cool. Do you know your Enneagram type?
I do. I'm a type 9.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, why you're
Yeah,
in the position that you're in why you're in the position that you are,
yeah.
which is
No, I
mediation.
am. It's mediation, and it's the sort of the acute sensitivity to discord and wanting to resolve the discord that sort of drives me. I was not, I was more of a Myers-Briggs sort of fan in the personality type world, and it's only recently that I've kind of checked out the
What are you,
Enneagram. But
like
when
an INTP or something?
I'm an INTP, oh, good one, yeah, INTP, good guess.
Thanks. It's what I do for a living.
So anyway, when I read uh, Type 9 stuff on the Enneagram, I was like, oh wow, this is perceptive. Not because it's, you read something on INTP and it's like, oh yeah, that describes me. But like there was something more challenging about reading about Type 9 because it pointed out sort of flaws of my personality in a way that were kind of meaningful and thought provoking in a way that I don't find to be true for like Myers Briggs. So yeah,
Yeah. Do you know about the tri type?
I heard you describe it to Ryan when you did the podcast with him. Which type are you?
So actually, these days, I'm identifying it as a 7.
Okay.
I identified it as a 9 for about a year, just to give it a try
Uh huh.
and sort of divorce myself from identifying with my main fixation or personality type. And my tri type is 794.
794. Yeah. Tell me what that means because
So
I don't know.
if I were to guess yours, I would probably say something like 952, which is known as the problem solver.
Okay. I'll have to look that up.
The 5 is like the investigator.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the 2 is the helper.
Okay. That sounds about right. Yeah, that sounds about right. I'm surprised that you were able to guess INTP, because most people I think would guess that I'm a J, but I'm actually more of a P, and that's been something that I've sort of gone back and forth on.
Yeah,
But
but it's like you lean more towards collecting, staying open
open to
to
what's
new
right.
information rather than arriving at a conclusion
Yep.
compulsively.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
um, INTJs, they're going to be quick as judging types. They're going to be quick to arrive at conclusions.
Yeah. To snap into a point of view.
Perceivers are
Yeah.
always staying open to new information. I'm an ENTP.
ENTP. Okay. Extrovert.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's by the strongest is introvert, which you wouldn't know it because, I can be very social, but when
And
it
I'm
comes
not
to,
social though. I
yeah,
mean,
see, that's interesting.
yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with the way people understand extrovert and introvert is pretty wrong.
Right. How would you
They
describe?
think of it in terms of social. The actual
Right.
word extroversion means outward facing.
Mm-hmm.
Introversion is inward facing.
Mm-hmm.
And so outward facing can mean you're looking at people.
Right.
And a lot of extroverts do sort of gravitate towards people. ENTPs are known as the most introverted extrovert because,
Right.
I
Because
don't know.
you're
We're sort of we can look at people or anything outside of us and sort of like draw connections between things.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're sort of interested in extroverted intuition is more oriented towards understanding like the hidden connections between things.
Yep. So you would say that, like, while many extroverts are oriented towards people, you're sort of more into, like, you're more oriented towards the sort of the world and systems and processes than you are people, or no? Am I drawing?
Yeah, and ideas,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, like
Yeah.
um yeah.
I've always gone with the best definition being, where do you get and spend your energy? And so, by that framework, introverts get energy by being themselves and being in a book or whatever, and then they spend it by being with others. And that extroverts get their energy by being with others and being in dynamic sort of, scenarios that charges them up.
Yeah, see, I don't like that one because
Mhm.
I don't think we get energy that way. And
You don't think?
a lot of extroverts, they feel exhausted by social
Oh,
situations.
interesting. Okay. All right. Yeah.
And that
That
has a
definitely.
lot to do with the expectations of the social domain. You're supposed to act a certain way. So
Mhm.
So introverts often feel a pressure to be a certain way in social settings, and that is more the drain.
Right.
And the
Right.
same is true of extroverts. I mean, I know plenty of like ESFJs, ESTJs, and so on and so forth. They an ESFP. I have a friend of mine who, you see him in a social context, and he's like working the crowd and doing all these things, and
Yeah.
he's like, "Wow, this guy's really energized." And then he leaves, and he's just like, "Oh, I'm so drained."
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's good to know. Because I certainly feel that way, although I enjoy it. Like, to me, if I got, which is pretty rare these days, but let's say I was, able to get 4 days by myself or something like that, like, I would soak it up. I'd love it. I'd watch a ton of TV. I'd read books. I'd go take little walks and, think my thoughts. But then at the end of that, like, I'm juiced up. I'm like, you could throw me in a party and I'll be super social and engaged. And, I love to spend the energy that I get doing it. But after a little while, I feel like I got to retreat back to my back to
Yeah, and
my
I think if
cave.
we were allowed to just like let our energy drop and not worry about other people being like, what's wrong with him? Get him out of here.
Right. Right.
You know,
Yeah.
then if we could normalize that, then we'd all be better off.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, just letting people be like tired or bored and, not wanting to participate and so on and so forth.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Okay, man. Well, yeah, we're at 2 hours now. So
Okay.
I think I'm gonna call this a success.
I'll
I
call
think
it the
we
same.
we have transcended and included the apocalypse here,
Excellent.
and we've saved the world sufficiently enough for today. So thanks for coming on. I'm probably gonna
Yeah,
be in
my
the Bay
pleasure.
Area soon, so I'll hit you up and
Yeah, hit me up. It'd be great to hang out.
we can get together and smoke a joint or two and uh, you know talk
Sounds like a
shop.
plan. When in Oakland.
Yeah, exactly. All right, man.
All right. Thanks, Marshall. Good talk with you. Take care.
Namaste, and now I'm gonna go.
Okay. Later.
Ciao.